Good evening and welcome to the Carnegie Museum of the Keweenaw's online presentation, The Spanish Flu and Hockey by Bill Sproule. My name is Elise Nelson. I am the director of the Carnegie Museum and will be the moderator this evening. First, a word about the Carnegie Museum. All Carnegie Museum exhibits and presentations, including the Zoom event, are made possible through donations of members and supporters. Please consider becoming a member or donating to support the museum. Go to our website, carnegiekeweenaw.org, for information, including a membership form and donation button. Thank you. I'd like now to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. William Sproule, who joined Michigan Tech in 1996 and taught in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering until his recent retirement. Over the years, Bill taught a variety of courses in traffic engineering, transportation planning, airport planning, highway design, public transit, and most notably for us this evening, hockey history. The author of several books about Copper Country history, Bill's professional interests are evident in his local history publications. In 2013, he published Images of Rail, Copper Country Streetcars, and in 2019, Houghton, the Birthplace of Professional Hockey. Both books are resplendent with historical photos and deeply researched text and are available locally at Northwind Books in Hancock. Tonight's talk is based on research for the latter book. Bill, we welcome you and look forward to hearing your presentation discussing local hockey and its convergence with the last pandemic.
Thank you, Elise. Kind of a nice introduction. Elise and I talked a few weeks ago about a presentation on hockey, and my wife said, "Well, why don't you combine the two and talk about the flu or the pandemic in hockey?" And there is a great story that I'm going to tell you today. I'm actually going to add on a couple of slides to talk about a couple of other sports at that time too. So it gives you some sense what it was like, and you'll actually be surprised at some of the similarities to the pandemic we're having now. So that's what we're going to tackle tonight. I guess really it was the flu pandemic of 1918, and as you get older, you put a few notes on your PowerPoint slides so you can remember them yourself. You get so excited you forget things. So I've got a few notes here to kind of guide me through. It actually started in 1918 and really went on for over a year or year and a half in the pandemic flu. You can see here about a third of the world's population were contacted the flu, or infected with the flu, and it estimated as high as 50 million died in that, worldwide died in that with the flu. Almost 30 million were infected in the United States. The population at the time, you can see, is about a third of the U.S. population were affected, and you can see the number, 675,000 died in the United States. Now, it's kind of interesting, you always think of young and old. Well, there were a number of people died less than 5 and older than 65, but there were not that many people over 65. At the time, the life expectancy in 1918 was about 60. The largest group of people that died were in this 20 to 40 age group, and over almost a half of the people that died were in that group. I put it in just comparison in Canada. There was 50,000 died in Canada. Now, there's really no consensus of where it originated. There are stories that it was in Germany, or there were episodes of the flu in Germany, France, the UK. But in the United States, the first cases reported were in February of 1918. And by March of 1918, several soldiers were sick at an army base in Kansas. And that's really where many thought this originated, was through this army base in Kansas. And the army base, Camp Funston, was a U.S. Army training camp. And so recruits would come into the camp for a number of weeks, get basic training, and then be sent to other bases in the United States, and then eventually get to Europe. So this is 1918, the last year of the First World War. Now, how did it get the name Spanish flu? Well, I said before is that it could have started in Germany, it could have started in Britain, or could have in France, but the World War I censors minimized the early reports of the illness. And the same in the United States. The U.S. government kind of suppressed any of this activities for this flu. But in May of 1918, the disease spread to Europe, and newspaper stories started to appear in Spain. So this is just an article out of a Spanish newspaper with a post dated Madrid in the end of May. And Spain was neutral in World War I, so they didn't fall under the same censorship. So the disease became known as the Spanish flu. Now, it struck victims fairly quickly. You probably recognize many of these that we have for the coronavirus today. Start with a cough, a stuffy nose, high fever, pain, some difficulty in breathing. You'd end up with bleeding from the nose and mouth. Your skin may turn purple. And then that was really into the pandemic or into the pneumonia. And it really occurred very quickly. So some people called it the 3-day flu. You could have it, and within 3 days you'd be fine. But if you got severe symptoms, you could be, you could die. So here's the famous curve that that we're becoming familiar with, the peaks in the of the flu. And there were kind of 3 waves of peaks. There was that first in the summer, spring and summer. It kind of peaked in July of 1918. And then the second peak was October, November, and which we're experiencing now with the pandemic. And then it subsided through different actions that people took. And then it kind of reappeared in March. So and there was actually, it actually reappeared in 1920 in Europe. So it was kind of shifted a bit. Checking the newspapers in the late 1918 in the Copper Country, it was really kind of November, December is when it peaked here, a little behind the national peaks. Here's the standard poster that would come out: cough and sneeze into the handkerchief. It's spread by contact. Avoid crowds. If possible, walk to work. Do not spit on the floor or the sidewalk. Avoid fatigue. If taken ill, go to bed and send a doctor. So there was a number of activities like quarantines. There were several social distancing measures. There were shutdowns. There were bans on gatherings, a number of other restrictions. Well, this is the front page of the Seattle newspaper in October 1st of 1918. Churches, schools, shows closed, ban on public assemblies, somewhat of a shutdown. Then there was a requirement for masks at the time. Now, this was controversial, as it is maybe today. There were groups that would anti-mask meetings. There were fines. Kind of interesting headline in one that 3 were shot in a struggle with a masked slacker. It seemed that occurred more on the West Coast. But you see this one police officer telling somebody, arresting someone that was not wearing a mask. President Woodrow Wilson, he was the president at the time. He was focusing on the war effort, and many were critical of his leadership on the flu. But he was focused on the U.S. efforts in the war. He actually did contact the flu in April of 1919 while negotiating the end of World I, the peace treaty in Paris at the Versailles. Wilson actually suffered a stroke in October of 1919, and he died in 1924. So some would say he was weakened by the flu. I didn't get into that much detail. I've got a couple of sources that I'll share later that you can find out more about Wilson. Well, sports in the fall of 1918 was really disrupted. You can see the headline, it plays havoc with the sporting world. At that time, the two major sports in the United States were football, college football, and Major League Baseball. And so a number of things took place. Well, Major League Baseball, its season began as scheduled in mid-April. So if you think back onto this is kind of before the first peak. Now, Major League Baseball did end 1 month earlier. It ended in early September, but it wasn't because of the flu. It ended because of this requirement. On July 1st of 1918, part of the war effort, all draft-eligible men employed in non-essential occupations must apply for work related to the war effort or risk being called into military service. Well, you can imagine baseball teams may fall into this category. And in early July, they declared baseball on this list of non-essentials. So the government and the baseball leagues agreed to or the negotiated agreement to end the season in early September and then play the World Series. So you can see the baseball schedule was reduced. It did return to normal in the following year, but this is it ended early that year. Well, baseball players all wore masks, face coverings. The fans wore masks. The umpires wore masks. I should see if anybody remembers who won the World Series that year. Well, it was the Boston Red Sox. They defeated the Chicago Cubs in the 1918 World Series. Kind of a trivia question. The Boston Red Sox didn't win the World Series again until 2004. And the Chicago Cubs, it was even longer. They didn't win until 2016. Now, interesting on this particular team was Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was a star pitcher for the Red Sox, but he was also an outstanding hitter. He almost died from the flu in May of 1918. Several other players during the season contracted the flu. Babe Ruth also got the flu in the second wave in that late fall. Most will know all kinds of Babe Ruth stories after. As I said, play resumed in the following year. It started in in mid-April, and they completed the full season in 1919. Now, college football, many college campuses were closed in the fall. You can see the pandemic or those peaks again. Several colleges did not play football. They just canceled their football program altogether. Now, President Wilson, he encouraged football. He said it added to the overall morale of the country. And several military organizations, camps or bases, fielded teams, and they played against college teams. So they filled in with many of these colleges that did close. Now, the football schedule did not start till late October, early November, and the teams played fewer games. The games had lower attendance. It wasn't mandated. Just people didn't come to the games. Spectators were to wear masks. Now, the biggest game of the year was in November 23rd of 1918 at Forbes Field in Pittsburgh. And over 30,000 attended this game. The Georgia Tech Golden Tornadoes, I guess they're now the Yellow Jackets, they were coached by John Heisman. And Heisman probably recognized that from the Heisman Trophy status. Georgia Tech was undefeated in 33 games coming into this game. And 2 weeks earlier, they defeated North Carolina State, kind of a one-sided score. Their opponents were the Pittsburgh Panthers, and they were coached by Pop Warner. Those who play youth football, there's Pop Warner leagues throughout the United States, and they were undefeated in 30 games. So this was a big game that generated a lot of interest. Well, here's a look at the fans at this game. Pittsburgh won 32-0. Now, Pittsburgh did lose a week later to the Cleveland Naval Reserves to end their 32-game win streak. And that's why I said that several naval or military bases or groups set up teams. So this is one of them, the Cleveland Naval Reserves, a group of naval personnel had a team. Pittsburgh and Michigan were named the NCAA co-national champions that year, but they only played 5 games. This photo right here is a photo of November 23rd, 1918, a game between the University of Michigan and the Michigan Agricultural College. Well, and Michigan beat the Michigan Agricultural College, or now Michigan State. They beat them 21-6. This is Ferry Field in Ann Arbor. So you can see, looking at it, tough to see, but the fans are wearing masks, and it's not a full house. Well, I should say that the only bowl game of that year was the Rose Bowl. And the team, the Mare Island Marines out of California, played the Great Lakes Naval Station out of Illinois. And the Naval Station team won the Rose Bowl in that year. Well, we started out talking about hockey. Well, we better get to hockey. At the time, there were 2 major professional hockey leagues that were operating. Now, there were a number of players that were serving in World War I, so they were not available. And the 2 leagues, the National Hockey League, had 3 teams: Montreal Canadiens, Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto Arenas. The Arenas became the Toronto St. Pats, and they eventually became the Toronto Maple Leafs. And the 3 teams in the other league, the Pacific Coast Hockey League, were the Seattle Metropolitans, Vancouver Millionaires, and the Victoria Cougars. The Victoria Cougars eventually became the Detroit Cougars in the mid-1920s, when the Pacific Coast Hockey League folded. And now between 1914 and 1925, the champions of these 2 leagues would play for the Stanley Cup. Prior to 1914, it was a challenge trophy. And then after 1925, it became the exclusive trophy for the National Hockey League. But there was a period in there, the champion of each of these leagues would play for the Stanley Cup. Now, the first National Hockey League player to die from the flu was this gentleman right here, Hanley Shore. He died in October of 1918. His wife came down with the flu. Within a few days, he contracted the flu and he died. You see his age is 32. And he was on 3 Stanley Cup champion teams way back to the 1903, for 3 or 4 years with the Ottawa Silver Seven. That was a team, kind of some of the best players of that era. And he played for several seasons with the Ottawa Senators in the National Hockey Association, which then became the National Hockey League. So I put this slide in. This person didn't die from the flu, but it's an interesting story. Many people have heard of Hobey Baker. Hobey Baker was a player, a hockey player at Princeton University from 1910 to 1914. He was probably the first college superstar, and he also played football for Princeton. He's in the college. He's in the Hall of Fame in both football and hockey. He and many know the Hobie Baker Trophy of today. He died in a plane crash at the end of World War I. And there's lots of stories about Hobie Baker out there and his and dying in a plane crash. I put this in here to kind of remind you that World War I ended on November 11th. So, as the World War I was ending, this is kind of an interesting time. Now back to hockey. The National Hockey League, their season began at the end of December. Only the 3 teams now, and they played 18 games. The Pacific Coast didn't start until January 1st, so it's kind of after that second peak. Montreal defeated Ottawa in their league championships or league playoffs, and Seattle defeated Vancouver in their league playoffs. Now Vancouver had a famous player called Cyclone Taylor. Cyclone Taylor played in the Houghton area in the early 1900s for the Portage Lake hockey team. There was also another Copper Country link to this, is a fellow named Charles Yuskala. He's born in Calumet. He played for Vancouver at the time. Charles went on to he retired shortly after this series, and he went on to a figure skating career. He was and one of the founding members of the Ice Capades, an interesting person. Well, at the time, Montreal Canadiens would play the Seattle Metropolitans for the Stanley Cup in a best-of-5 final series. This year, it was in Seattle. So each year, the location would alternate between an East Coast and a West Coast. This 1919, the Montreal Canadiens had to travel from Montreal across Canada to Seattle. And they stopped a couple of times. It was a week-long trip on the train to make that. They stopped a couple of times for exhibition games or in a couple of cities in Canada. Now, the games were played at the Seattle Ice Arena in downtown Seattle. Now, at the time, we're past that second peak, so the measures were relaxed in Seattle, and all the games that Seattle played that year were to full capacity. So this was going to be a big event in Seattle with the Stanley Cup Finals. This is a photo of the Seattle Metropolitans. Now, I haven't identified every player, but I've identified a few, and there's some good stories here. Hap Holmes is the goalie, so you can pick him out in the back row. And then there are Frank Fulston and Jack Walker. So Holmes, Fulston, and Walker are all in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. Muzz Murray, he's the fourth from the left in the back row. He was born and raised in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. He's in the U.S. Hockey Hall of Fame. Now, the couple of other people I've put on this list, Bernie Morris was their captain. He's located on the third from the left, kneeling. Now, Bernie Morris was their top scorer that year. He was also the top scorer in the 1917 Stanley Cup Championship or series. And for trivia people, the Seattle Metropolitans were the first American team to win the Stanley Cup in 1917. They beat the Montreal Canadiens in 4 games. The best of 5, they beat them 3-1. Well, this Bernie Morris scored 14 goals in that 4-game series, and he actually scored 6 goals in the deciding game. Well, I said he was their leading scorer for the Metropolitans all year. but he could not play in the NHL finals in 1919. He had been arrested as a draft invader. He's from Canada, but he'd lived in Seattle for a number of years, and he was drafted by the Army. Well, he went to trial, and he was going to be sent to Alcatraz for 2 years as his penalty. Well, he negotiated. He joined the Army and was discharged. Received a honorable discharge instead of heading to Alcatraz. The coach was Pete Muldoon. Good story about Pete is he later became the first coach of the Chicago Blackhawks in 1926. The team finished third that year, and the owner of the Blackhawks, a fellow named of McLaughlin, was a little upset with him that the team didn't do better, and he threatened to fire him. So as Muldoon said, "Fire me and you'll never finish first again." This was called the curse of the Muldoon. The Blackhawks never finished first until 1967. So the curse lasted 40 years. So that's the Seattle Metropolitans. The Montreal Canadiens, this is their lineup. They everyone listed below is in the Hockey Hall of Fame in Toronto. George Vezina is the goalie. Joe Malone was one of their top scorers. Didier Petre and Newsy Lalonde and Joe Hall all played in the International Hockey League, in which Houghton was a team in that league. Newsy Lalonde was their coach, captain, and he was their highest scorer. Now, the gentleman not in uniform is the owner. And the owner is a fellow named George Kennedy. We'll see. I've got a story for him later. I said Didier Petre, he played for Sault Michigan in the league, the International Hockey League, and Newsy Lalonde played for Sault Canada in the International League, and Joe Hall played for Portage Lake. So he played one season in Houghton. All-star forward. He was the second highest scorer in the league, second to Didier Petre. But he also led the league in total minutes. He actually averaged almost 5 minutes of penalties every game. So there's lots of stories of how he got the name Bad Joe Hall, but he had a very aggressive style. But you can read more about him. They say he played 1 year for Portage Lake. They won the league championship that year. And then he returned to Canada. He played for Quebec and Montreal, and he was on 3 Stanley Cup winning teams. In 1913, he was the oldest player in the National Hockey League. Interesting story. Now we got to get to the series. Well, the Stanley Cup Finals, as you know, in Seattle. The first game was on March 19th, and Seattle beat Montreal 7-0. Now, I put a little note on here, the PCHA and the NHL rules. There's a little bit of difference on the two of them. And you can see who won depending on what rules were being played. The Pacific Coast Hockey League was still using 7 players. Well, the players were the 2 defensemen, the goalie, and 3 forwards. And the 7th player was something called a rover. And a rover was often your best player. They would play forward, they'd play defense, they would cover the whole ice. Defensemen just stayed in one end, forwards stayed in the other end. The other thing was there were some differences on passing rules. There were on forward passing between the 2 leagues. And the other rule that was different is that the NHL allowed subs for penalized players. What I mean by that is that if a player was penalized, you could put in a sub for them. So there's some differences on the rules. So Montreal won the second game. Seattle won the third game. The fourth game under NHL rules was tied 0-0 after 2 overtime periods. The NHL rules at the time you'd only play 2 overtime periods if it was, and that would end the game. Well, so you can see that we're basically, so we had to play a fifth game, and quite a bit of discussion as to who rules we should play. They decided to play with the NHL rules. Montreal beat Seattle 4-3. Montreal, the score after the second period was 3-0 for Seattle. Montreal scored 3 goals in the third period and won it in overtime. Well, these 2 overtime games took a lot out of the players, because if you look at the photos, there weren't a lot of extra players. At that time, many of the players would play virtually all of the game and have very little substitutions. So the deciding game was to be on April 1st of 1919, and it was to end but before the game took place, several of the Montreal Canadiens became ill with the flu. There was actually 7 Montreal Canadiens, and their owner became ill with the flu. They stayed in their hotel, but then the owner said, and manager Kennedy said, well, we'll forfeit the series. Seattle said, no, that wouldn't be fair. So then Montreal said, well, can we bring in some recruits from another Pacific Coast team? And the person controlling the tournament said, no, you can't. So 5.5 hours before the start of the deciding game, they decided to cancel the series. So the hockey series was canceled. 2 games won by Seattle, 2 games won by Montreal, and 1 game then tied. Well, actually, Joe Hall, they took him to the hospital on that evening, and he remained in the hospital for a couple of days he had a fever of 105 degrees, and he passed away. He died on April the 5th. His funeral was held in Vancouver just 3 or 4 days later, and then the other person that really was hit very hard with the flu was the owner, this George Kennedy. This is kind of the long-term effects. He came down with the flu, but the long-term effects, he died a couple of years later. Well, the Stanley Cup is actually recognizes this item. If you look at the Stanley Cup up near the bowl of the Stanley Cup, you look at the 1919, it says that the Montreal Canadiens, Seattle Metropolitans, the series was not completed. Well, there have been many books written about the pandemic, the 1918 flu, and really there's several new books that have just come out. But if you remember, it's kind of the 100th anniversary a couple of years ago, so that spurred a number of books. If you look on Amazon, you'll find a long list of books. Now, one of the books that, as I was developing research here, it's a book called The Great Influenza by John Barry. It was released in 2005. The interesting story of this particular book is that President George Bush read this book during his summer vacation in Texas in 2005, and became quite concerned. And he wondered, are we ready in the United States? So when he returned to Washington in the fall, he formed a committee to kind of prepare a pandemic playbook. What would happen if this were to happen in the United States? And then, so he left it for the Obama administration. They updated it, the playbook. Now, the Great Influenza book itself has been updated to 2018 to the 100th anniversary, but it is a fairly complete story of the Spanish flu. There are a couple of really very good websites. If you look at the CDC website, with their guidelines, you'll find a lot of historical stuff and photos for the flu. And the History Channel has prepared a couple of excellent documentaries on the Spanish flu. There are actually several books written on baseball and college football of that time. And there are kind of two easy read books on the hockey and the flu. One is called Fever Season, and the other is called Tough Guys. They are both written by Eric Zweig. And they really can pretty easy read. They're almost written for a young adult looking at so there is kind of the story. We've I guess the pandemic has hit, but thank you and stay well. And I guess we hope to open it up for some questions now, Elise.
This is Jerry McGinnis. Can you hear me?
I sure can, Jerry.
How did Nosy Lalonde get his nickname?
Nosy Lalonde worked in a newspaper plant in Cornwall, Ontario.
Oh, okay.
And he actually his first pro hockey team was the pro team in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, in the International Hockey League, 1904 to 1907.
Thank you.
Good question.
I have another question here from Cliff. What were the mortality rates in the Keweenaw in 1918 and 1919? Mortality rates.
I think it was fairly low, but I don't have those numbers handy. They're harder to find, and I didn't get that deep into.
Yeah, I bet. I'm just curious about active the copper country and also curious about what hospitals were in the area. I assume Calumet had a pretty big hospital, but was Portage Lake still around at the time?
Calumet had a very big hospital, and there was a hospital in Portage Lake. I forget the name of it though.
Interesting.
From Chris, was there a concern to start the following season?
No, the hockey season started 1919 on schedule. It's kind of interesting. You kind of look at, I actually did look into hockey in the copper country. They basically shut down during the First World War. So there was no senior hockey and the Cup was not awarded for 1917, 1918, and 1919, but it was awarded in 1920. So a lot of the hockey was closed down in the copper country during that time. And because so many were in the war.
There's another comment and question. One is the comment from Lee Best's iPhone is a great discussion. What caused the flu to go away?
I think they started to have vaccines. The vaccines came on, and and some of the measures that were taken kind of suppressed it, and then the vaccine started in 1920. There was a lot of work being done on vaccines during this couple of years. It took them a while, but they did find a vaccine that seemed to suppress a bit, and then it just seemed to, with all the measures that have been taken, it just seemed to disappear.
Bill, it's Jerry again. What was the name of the books used by Eric Sway? Was it SW?
Eric Sway. One is called Fever Season, and the other is called Tough Guys.
Good, thank you.
And Eric Zweig, it's Z-W-E-I-G. He's written a number of books. But those two are kind of easy read that deal with the hockey element of that. And,
I'm sorry.
You'll find on the photo on the fever season, the photo of Joe Hall is on the cover.
From Kate Tripp, how long were businesses, churches, and schools shut down?
They were, I'm not exactly sure, but I think they were 2 or 3 weeks at a time.
At a time or for one time?
Well, it varied depending which part of the country. In Seattle, it was in October, much of October. And then, as you read in the Great Influenza, there was a lot of hot spots. Philadelphia, New York were especially hot spots. And there was, as you get into it more, you'll find that they did all kinds of things to try and discourage it. And in Philadelphia, it was a major victory parade that kind of was the super spreader.
I have another question, and I think this might be just easier to ask rather than to type.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Well, we obviously all know, the major reasons for the Great Depression, but were there any correlation to the Spanish flu, and then, roughly about 10 years later, the Great Depression? Were there any links with the businesses or the economy affected by it at all?
I really don't know the answer to that question. I don't know.
There's another
How about
question.
a professional opinion?
I'm not that, that's getting outside my area. I really don't know. The 1920s were a boom time. So the US economy kind of boomed in the 1920s. And it was the 1929 that the stock market fell apart. So I'm not sure that I'm not sure what the impact on the flu was. It's kind of the end of World War I that probably had a greater impact.
Okay.
Mitchell Lake has a question. Is that the only Stanley Cup band that says incomplete, or were there others?
The Stanley Cup was not contested in 2004, but I don't think it has anything on the Stanley Cup that it was not contested in 2004, 2005. That was a player strike that year. So my understanding is the only one that says it wasn't completed. And the bands on the Stanley Cup are there are 5 or 6 bands, but this note is on the bowl, just below the bowl of the cup. So it's there all the time.
You'll see that when you see the rest of the slides.
Yeah.
Well, are there any more questions? Speak now or type now. Oop. Michael Mallow is asking, where did the influenza come from?
That is always a debate. They're not exactly sure what the initial thing, other than locating it. There's many different theories as to where it did come from. It seemed to have, in the U.S., it seemed to emanate at that fort at the camp in Kansas. The one book that I suggest is that President Bush read. He has great details, and he has presented. John Barry has presented a number of theories as to where it did come from, and it's been a subject of research by many to try and trace what happened, where did it come from, what did it cause, and so on. And there's no really consensus that this is where it really came from. Barry, in his book, The Great Influenza, has laid out a number of the theories and discussion on it.
Another question from Lee Best's iPhone. Has the cup made it to Houghton?
Oh, yes, the cup has been here a number of times. It has it has been here. Well, it was here in the 2004 for the hockey celebrations. It has been here when Randy McKay won the Stanley Cup in 1995 and 2000. It was here a couple of years ago when the Michigan Tech played, and it was here last fall for Hockeyville. So it's been here a number of times.
Faith has put in the chat the spelled out the book that you mentioned, the Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history. I will also put that in the subsequent email. So.
It appears in one of the slides too.
Right. So when you see the rest of the slides.
And there's another slide that has about 6 or 7 different books. You'll find if you do an Amazon search, you'll find several new books and several documents. The other websites that are quite good is the CDC website. They have a whole wealth of resources available and studies, and it really kind of gets to that question, different theories as to where and why the pandemic started.
Here's another question from Chris. Did the flu spike throughout Seattle during the playoff time frame?
No, it was just around that time. It didn't. It was kind of the third wave. The third wave was really was just starting in Seattle at the time.
Marie Cleveland comments that it says on the cup that the 2004-2005 season not played.
Okay, that's good. Got a good audience here. Got a good audience.
Yeah, good to have fact checkers.
Oh, yes.
Available all the time. Okay. I'll give you 20 more seconds to ask more questions, and then, oh, this is a comment. Great presentation. Thank you. I would ditto that.
Thank you very much.
Applause and thank you, Bill, from Philip Kendall. I want to, on behalf of the museum, I want to thank Bill again for your enjoyable presentation. So you can check our website. You can sign up for our e-newsletter to keep up on things. We've got a bunch of things coming up very shortly in the fall. And look on Facebook where we post current events, future programs. And please consider joining the museum if you're able to at this time. I want to thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at another event soon. And thank you, Bill, so much.
Thank you, Elise.